Hey, welcome back to our study of informal fallacies. We've been looking in the last several sessions on the fallacies of relevance, and today we're going to be picking up where we left off. This is going to be our third video out of 4 covering the fallacies of relevance. So why don't we just go ahead and dive right in. We are going to be moving on this time to the attempts to distract, focusing in specifically on what we might call inappropriate authorities. So these are going to be the 5 attempts to distract that we're going to be looking at in this session. And we're going to see another group actually in our next video. And again, I'm not going to read through these on this screen. I'm just going to set them out there, but it's only these 5. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off last time with our 15th fallacy called the consensus gentium. But before I get directly to that fallacy, I want to take a look at what we mean by attempts to distract. These are distraction techniques. Obviously, they're used to distract somebody, but they're used to prevent somebody from recognizing what's actually relevant to support a conclusion. They divert your attention away from legitimate reasoning on whatever issue you're discussing or investigating, the issue at hand. And the inappropriate authority arguments fallaciously substitute something as an authority for establishing the truth of a matter in place of reasons that are relevant for establishing the truth of that matter. Now, the first one, like I said, is the consensus gentium, and I know we looked at it briefly last time, but it means agreement of the people. It's an appeal to the majority, the masses, not who believes, which was the ad populum, which we looked at last time, but how many people believe. The fallacy of believing or doing something because it's widely popular, or attempting to get others to believe something because most other people do the same thing, and arguing that something's true because the majority of people believe it. Right? Now, the opinion of the majority is presented as a relevant authority. However, it's obvious that the truth of an argument never, ever hinges on how many people believe it. That's very important to keep in mind. So, with the consensus gentium, let's take a look at some examples. In Philadelphia, nearly everyone reads the Bulletin, which happens to be a newspaper. No one believes in realism since Kant's critique of pure reason. Same-sex marriage is wrong because 70% of Americans are opposed to it. You should believe in God because most of the world believes in God, or a God exists. You should accept the theory of evolution as fact because most biology professors do. Or 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. Our next fallacy is the Argumentum ad ignorantium, and that argues that an idea is true because we do not know that it's not true. It argues for truth based on a lack of evidence of falsity. Right? X is true because no one has proven X is false. In other words, a lack of evidence is presented as evidence to the contrary. However, kind of a good catchphrase to remember, that lack of evidence is not evidence. And the burden of proof, I'm sure you've heard that term before, is normally placed on the people making the affirmative case or those that are making the weightier claim. That's a general procedure. Okay, so we could think of, who has the responsibility to make the case when we talk about a burden of proof. Likewise, it's fallacious to reason that something's false because there's no evidence of it being true. The burden of proof is generally not on the person making the negative claim, but there is a difference between not having a reason to believe X is true and having a reason to believe X is not true. Lack of evidence may be a good reason to believe that a claim is false under certain circumstances, like where it's highly likely that evidence would surface and where a careful and extensive search was conducted. So, for example, if I made the claim that there is a dog under the bed, that can be proven false by simply looking under the bed and seeing if the dog's there and seeing that the dog is not there. Because the bed, under the bed, right, is kind of a closed, small location, and a dog is generally not a microscopic animal, and I could, pick it up with the naked eye. So, we could schematize the whole thing probably this way. Premise: nobody has proven that X is true, therefore I'm going to go ahead and conclude that X is false. That doesn't work. Let's look at a film clip illustrating this very point.
20 microwaves gone from my inventory. Everywhere you look, things are going missing. We've got trains crashing, people vanishing, Belmont County's without power. You know what this feels like to me? This feels like a Russian invasion.
I don't think that the Russians have anything to do with what's going on in town, but I am calling the curfew.
Unless you can tell me who's been messing around with our stuff, I say it's the Soviets.
So let's look at some other examples of the ad ignorantium. Aliens exist because no one's proven that they don't. Or alternatively, aliens don't exist because no one's proven that they do. This one is still pretty popular. God must exist because no one can prove that he doesn't. Or King David doesn't exist because he isn't mentioned in any text outside the Bible. Here, absence of evidence is cited as evidence of absence, and prior to 1993, this was actually the case that was often made. But in 1993, the Tel Dan Stela was discovered, and people started to change their minds. So as soon as you start to have a little bit of evidence, the whole thing switches in the other direction. He can't prove that he earned the money, so he must have stolen it. Or people have been trying for centuries to provide conclusive evidence for the claims of astrology, and no one has ever succeeded. Therefore, we must conclude that astrology is a lot of nonsense. Now, the burden of proof should be on those that accept astrology, right? And many of those people have put forth what they believe amounts to evidence, however anecdotal, but this is different from debunking all of those claims. Of course, if there is no conclusive evidence that could be accepted, then there's no reason to believe. But it might be better to remain agnostic rather than dogmatic on the question. And that might be a judgment call. Because as we said earlier, there are exceptions. If a qualified researcher investigates a phenomenon within their range of expertise and fails to turn up evidence after a long and careful examination, the fruitlessness itself might be positive evidence to the contrary. For example, teams of scientists tried for decades to detect luminiferous ether and failed to do so. Thus, luminiferous ether is probably something that doesn't exist. And the conclusion, I think, is inductively strong. And we also have procedural exceptions. When it comes to legal matters, the standard of proof in our judicial system is beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, you have heard the prosecution present its case. Nothing, however, has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, by law, you must find the defendant not guilty. Our next fallacy is called the Argumentum ad verecundiam, which means an appeal to reverence, or we just generally call it an appeal to authority. The fallacy is appealing to authority as a substitute for an argument. Instead of presenting evidence to support the conclusion, you cite the supposed authority who agrees with your conclusion. And that may take the form of an implicit appeal to even your own authority, like just trust me. The implication being just accept what I'm saying because I'm smarter than you. The general scenario plays on people's desire to be viewed as intelligent by agreeing with others who are considered intelligent. The appeal to authority is not in itself fallacious. It's reasonable to trust legitimate authorities in many cases, right? Most of what we know we learn by trusting authorities. Just think about that for a minute. No one can learn everything firsthand. Science, history, news, the list goes on. Most of the things that you think you know, you're just taking somebody's word for it. So it's often wise to accept a consensus view of legitimate authorities on matters relevant to their expertise. However, the rejection of the consensus view is also rationally defensible where several criteria could be met. So, for instance, number one, you can explain the consensus on the basis of some kind of sociological, psychological, or philosophical, theological reason. Now, no, this is not the genetic fallacy. In other words, rejecting an argument or view based on its origin. It's rather questioning the appeal to authority as the reason to hold the view. It's attempting to show why the consensus may have obtained apart from the strength of the actual evidence. And the second criteria is there is an intellectually rigorous alternative view. So the actual fallacy is what we might call an illegitimate appeal to authority. It becomes fallacious when, number one, the authority is irrelevant. It's not an authority, like a movie star talking about politics, or somebody's not an authority in the right field, like a physicist talking about tax law. Where an authority is unreliable, they have a reputation for inaccuracy, like the National Enquirer, is biased or prejudiced. Because remember, a biased individual may give an objectively true claim, but we're after the argument, not accept the claim on so-and-so's authority. Where the authority is unnecessary, maybe there's a better or clearer argument from reason that exists. Where the appeal is dogmatic, claiming absolute certainty rather than probability. Or where the appeal is uncritical, meaning there's no good reason why the authority should be trusted and ignores debate and disagreement within a field. It doesn't acknowledge that authorities often differ in their conclusions, or fails to distinguish interpretation of facts from the facts themselves, which is often where the biggest debate lies. Rational people often end in completely different places, starting with the same facts but having different presuppositions. That's incredibly important to remember. Just because somebody disagrees with you, we have a tendency to think of them as less intelligent, or how could they be so stupid as to believe this or that, when the fact is they could be very, very intelligent, and it's the presuppositions that they start with that lead them to the conclusions that they come up with. The main point of all of this is that no statement is true because of who said it. Statements are only true if they correspond with reality. If we're going to schematize it, it looks a little bit like this, which is hopefully familiar to you. The argument is going to cite an unqualified authority, and they're going to pose their conclusion, and you're just expected to go along with the conclusion based on the name or authority. So check out this little video clip that I think illustrates this fallacy perfectly.
I'm Morgan Freeman. I'm not a doctor, but I trust science. And I'm told that for some reason people trust me. So here I am to say, I trust science and I got the vaccine. If you trust me, you'll get the vaccine.
Now I think that illustrates the point, but I think we should still take a look at some other examples. Ho Chi Minh was not a tyrant. Jane Fonda said so. Euclid said that the square on the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal in area to the sum of the squares on the other two sides, so it must be true. Now, if you don't know who Euclid is, he happens to be a very, very important mathematician and geometer in the ancient Greek world. But even though he knows what he's talking about, the point is there is a much more direct way to prove that by actually demonstrating it, not necessarily citing somebody as an authority. There are probably billions and billions of extraterrestrial life forms. Carl Sagan thought so. I know Professor Thomas's explanation of natural law must be true because he lectures at the University of Paris. The chairman of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company testified before Congress that tobacco is not an addictive substance, so we should conclude that smoking does not lead to any addiction. Or, I know that ghosts are real because my uncle said he saw one once. Now, the advercundium can be legitimate when we have evidence that somebody is an accepted authority, the authority is speaking in the right field, the authority possesses the evidence, and we acknowledge that there are disputes among authorities. But moving on to our next fallacy, which is the argumentum ad futurum, or the appeal to the future. Here we have an argument that is based on some hoped-for result that has not yet occurred. The arguer assumes the future is going to provide that evidence. The appeal, then, is to the evidence that doesn't actually exist, and unobservable evidence obviously is not evidence. We could schematize it this way. The arguer is citing this time something that is possible in the future, and then they're going to propose their conclusion. So some examples. Embryonic stem cell research will one day produce a cure for paralysis. Therefore, we should continue down this road. A one-world government is best because it will produce peaceful conditions on Earth. You shouldn't believe in God because one day scientists will be able to prove that the universe exploded into existence without the need of that postulate. The next fallacy is wishful thinking. The wishful thinking fallacy actually involves arguing for something to be true simply because you want it to be true, arguing that something's true because it would just be cooler, or that it just sounds more fun to believe. Now, when we studied the appeals to emotion earlier, remember we emphasized that truth has absolutely nothing to do with our desires or feelings. So clearly this is also fallacious. Now, if we were to schematize it, again, it would look something like this, which should be very familiar to you at this point. The arguer likes X, whatever that is, and then they're going to pose the conclusion being X. Some examples of wishful thinking. It would be so cool if aliens really exist, so they probably do. I like the theory about George Bush being behind 9/11. It's more interesting. And finally, I find it more liberating to be a relativist. I'm not obligated to follow conventional rules or believe in some moral law. And with that, we've basically wrapped up our exploration of the appeals to authority. Next time, we're going to be turning our attention to attempts to distract, the diversion category. So that's it for now. Next time, like I said, we're going to be picking up with our fourth and final session on relevancy fallacies. But again, we're only halfway through because we still have an entire other category that we haven't even started yet, which are the presumption fallacies. So stick around, and until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.